All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the second Fireside chat about democracy and technology. And I think it's clear we find ourselves at a moment between promise and practice. And that's what I hope to get into with our two very special and distinguished guests. My name is Marietje Schaake. I'm a member of the European Parliament. And for those of you who heard the last panel, we heard Jane Harman suggesting that politicians are analog. And then later we heard Eric Schmidt suggesting that younger politicians tweet every 30 seconds. So I don't know, I think I'm somewhere in the middle, but let's see. At least in my daily life, I try to connect the worlds of politics and of technology for the sake of strengthening the rule of law online. We're also live streaming this, so it would help if people who want to chat would go outside so that people at home can actually hear the session. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our two guests. We have Brad Smith, who is president of Microsoft, and Alex Stamos, who is the chief security officer of Facebook. They will kick off with brief remarks, and then I'll ask them questions. Unfortunately, there's no room for questions in the audience, but we'll try to make it as interactive as possible. And we agreed on first-name basis. So, Brad, would you like to start, or is Alex going to start? Okay, Alex, go ahead.
Thank you, Marietje. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming into the Munich Security Conference, for making this issue a central part of the agenda today. My name's Alex. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Facebook. This is my second Munich Security Conference, and it's already been a pretty incredible experience. And I wanted just to open up a little bit by framing how we are looking, and me personally, at the issues that when we talk about democracy and technology, of how we got here and how that shapes how we have to think about where we're going. From what we're living through is in the last 10, 15 years, there has been a removal of the gatekeepers that used to control what is the legitimate bounds of discourse in democratic and non-democratic societies alike. For most of human history, very, very few people had their voices heard. And technological innovations, starting here in Germany with movable type and the printing press, gave the ability for individuals or small groups of people to be heard by thousands or tens of thousands of people. Our country, the US, has a long history of being founded by political radicals who used the printing press to their benefit to help them defeat the British Empire. And the growth of mass media in the 20th century somewhat expanded people's voices, but especially near the end, actually contracted that voice. By the time the 20th century ended, we were in a world where very few people decided what were things that were allowed to be talked about. What is the discussion in the public square was under the control of a very small set of very non-diverse people. That has changed clearly in the last 10, 15 years. New internet technologies and social media as an expression of those technologies have given voice to billions of people to be heard by millions or billions. And that has impacts on democracy, both positive and negative. The positives are clearly giving voice to people means that discussions that we would not have had 20 years ago are happening right now. Many of you have probably seen the women's marches around the world. The first of those was organized by a grandmother in Hawaii with a Facebook event. There are movements around police brutality in the United States, a global movement about the treatment of women. Those movements are powered by personal stories that never would have been heard in the mass media era when a small number of people decided what you would read about every day. And so those movements, I think, are positive for democracy. The fact that people's voices are heard is positive. Obviously, the flip side is that giving voice to people who haven't had it means giving voice to people who have radical extremist views, and giving the ability, due to the nature of the internet, for people to launder their views and make it look like there are a large number of people agreeing with them when they don't actually. I come from the traditional cybersecurity world. I was trained in my professional career to break things, to find flaws in technological systems, to help fix them, and to figure out how to investigate those problems. And as somebody who's up here, a computer nerd with a 300 baud modem in the 80s, to be sitting here among some of the greatest minds in national security and international relations, I think kind of demonstrates how our field has to grow up. Security is no longer just about technological flaws, while obviously that is still a component, but it's not exclusively about technological flaws and protecting data from being breached or stopping attacks to disrupt systems. It is now about studying the adversarial use of technology and figuring out the ways that technology can be misused to have societal level effects. So at Facebook specifically, we are making that pivot. We've talked about how we are doubling the number of people that work in this area. We're hiring 10,000 people that work on safety and security and content moderation. And that's not just about the number of people, but we're diversifying that team to make sure that we have people with the cultural and language skills necessary to operate in the over 100 languages that are spoken on Facebook. We are also applying our technological prowess to this issue, and I hope we get into more of the details of this, but things like machine learning are actually the really powerful tools for us to understand and fight extremist views and to understand the fake news phenomenon and to try to provide an authentic discussion area. So I'm looking forward to the discussion both up here, and then if I can catch you later, if you have things that you want to talk about, we understand that we're not alone in this battle. We can't do this by ourselves. That is why we're trying to build these relationships. Here in Germany, we have an excellent relationship with the Federal Information Security Office, the BSI, and that was deployed during the German election. We're looking to build those relationships with democracies so that we can hear from them the things that they think we can do better, and that we can have an open and productive dialogue. So thank you very much for coming.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here as well. And I think at the outset, it's worth reflecting on two things. The first is, as Alex has said, the internet has been a powerful force for giving people a voice, including in democratic processes. But then we're all really here because of the other side of that coin. Over the last couple of years, it has become apparent that the internet has also created new vulnerabilities for democracy. And we're all going to have to work together to protect democracy so those vulnerabilities are not exploited. I think one needs to start by understanding the problem, and not just the problem that exists today, but almost project a bit forward as to where this problem may evolve. It's not one problem. It's actually a multifaceted problem. And I think it's helpful to think a little bit about the different pieces. The first piece broke into the news, perhaps first in the United States in 2016 when we read about John Podesta's emails being hacked. So what we see is hacking of emails, including on some occasions emails that are Microsoft services, and then those emails being weaponized, them being released to try to alter the course of a campaign, and potentially what we may see, what we started to see in 2017, what we could see in the future, is people trying to mix real emails with fake emails, which will then put candidates on the defensive even more. So that's the first problem. The second problem is really foreign governments buying paid advertising to try to influence an election or a political debate in another country. And obviously we've seen some of that happen. And of course, one of the things that one does is respond to that. It's easy now to look for ads that are paid for in rubles, and it's therefore equally easy for people to pay for an ad in a currency other than rubles. And I think that captures an inherent part of this whole exercise, which is the cat and mouse dimension of it. The third part of the problem is the one that perhaps everybody's been talking about the most the last several months, which is the so-called issue of fake news. Things that are not actually paid for, but targeted to get a false story out and into circulation. I think that whenever one is talking about either paid ads or so-called fake news, it's helpful actually to understand a little bit of the differences between how that plays out on, say, a social media platform versus, say, a search engine or on other advertising platforms, because to some degree the solutions are different and we're going to have to factor all of that in. And then the last thing that I think is really important to think about is not the problem that we've had so far, but it's the worst problem we could have. And I think that would be the tampering with voting in a way that would cause constituents to conclude that the votes were not accurate. Because that is the fundamental underpinning of all democratic systems. And so we have to take new steps now that we've seen some initial efforts to probe, to identify potential weaknesses and the various aspects that go into the voting system, from the determination of who gets to vote, to the casting of votes, to the tabulation and reporting of votes, to secure our entire voting process. As we look to the future, I think we've got to be both pragmatic and we've got to be principled. I think we need to recognize that the private sector, the tech companies that have major platforms in this space, all of us have a very substantial, a high responsibility. But it would be equally a mistake, I think, to conclude that somehow tech companies can solve this problem by themselves. We need governments to stand up. We need clear laws in place for domestic elections, and we need international legal principles that will make clear what should be clear, that it's a violation of international law for governments to try to interfere in the democratic process of other countries, to undermine what is, in effect, part of the fundamental infrastructure of our lives. And so I think hopefully that helps frame some of the things that are worth thinking more about.
It does, and thank you very much also for keeping it short. You both represent major private sector players that operate globally. And I think one of the fundamental changes that we're seeing is that oftentimes digitization means privatization. And we talk about very fundamental issues like access to information, like voting, like democracy, the role of government versus the private sector. So I believe one of the key topics here is governance. And so I would like to hear from both of you a bit more about the role of the private sector and the tasks that it has in terms of governance versus laws that also determine what is and is not possible. I mean, we are here talking about democracy, but you, Microsoft and Facebook, operate globally, also in non-democracies. So how does this work? How do you think about governance? To what extent does profit drive governance? To what extent does the rule of law drive governance?
Well, I guess I would start by reflecting on the fact that we live in a multi-stakeholder world. I once had a conversation with a former senator who asked, when we think at Microsoft about who we are here to serve, who do we think about? And he expected me to say shareholders. And if it were 1983, I'm sure I would say shareholders. But the truth is we have multiple stakeholders. I actually put customers at the top of the list. Because especially in the world of technology today, the truth is customers are making a bigger bet on us than shareholders are. We love our shareholders, by the way, but customers are entrusting with us oftentimes their most precious data. And I think that creates a very high and even fundamental responsibility that we need to fulfill. So we need to think about customers. We actually think a lot about employees, because tech companies are fundamentally only as good as their employees. We think about shareholders, and then we think about the broader communities in which we work. Now, then to answer your question, I think typically what I find works best is to try to reduce an issue to a set of principles so that we can take a principled approach to addressing them. Different issues sometimes involve different principles, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I do believe that we still live in a world where there are certain universal human rights enshrined in the United Nations Charter, enshrined in other principal United Nations documents, and that we have a responsibility to adhere to them. And to be honest, sometimes that means we don't do business in a certain country with respect to a certain service. But we try to live up to those principles. The last thing I will say is, at the end of the day, we need to decide what values we're going to uphold. But I also tend to believe that in some ways the most important value in the world is that no one is above the law. No individual is above the law, no government is above the law, no company is above the law. And so I always try to remember, nobody ever elected us. And therefore, we need to be transparent so that people know what we're doing. But when you get to these important questions of public responsibility, of tensions between public values like public safety and privacy, I generally believe that those decisions are best made by governments who then reflect those decisions in laws that we then obey.
Okay, I'll get back to that, but I would like to hear about the governance versus profit from you as well.
So it's interesting. I think I have never been in a meeting at Facebook where an issue of principle or safety has been decided based upon dollars. And I think there's actually a misconception of the tech industry that is pretty pervasive about these decisions being made for short-term benefit. What you see, especially in the founder-led companies that have a very strong feeling of mission, is that we optimize for the long-term trust and health of the community. And the theory is, if people believe you're providing a good service, if they enjoy using your service, if you're in a situation where they keep on coming back voluntarily, none of us have a lock on these areas. The Silicon Valley is littered with the bleached skulls of the companies that have come before us, especially in social media. Focusing on maintaining the trust of people long term is the important part, and then the profits will eventually follow. And so I don't think I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is, I think Brad's totally right. We are not above the law, but what does that mean? The same law around the control of speech in Germany can be translated word to word in a number of languages and mean a very, very different thing when applied by those governments. And that is a constant balancing act that we find ourselves in, is being respectful of the laws in the countries that we operate, while also trying to uphold basic standards of human rights. And that is extremely difficult. The other difficulty is we build one community and set of products and platforms for the entire globe. And so when you talk about things that are directly affect the technical implementation of our product, it becomes extremely difficult to allow billions of people to communicate with each other in a way that national boundaries are not visible to them, and also then be compliant with all of those different standards. And so we try to, around, say, data protection law or privacy law, build the entire product to the highest standard of all the countries or regions in which we operate. But that can be challenging because then that sometimes directly conflicts with the requests that come from us other countries. And so there's no magic answer here. We try to be principled. We try to protect users and put users first. And we try to respect local law while also balancing that against the truth that the law is sometimes used against individuals in a way that is really hurtful.
Has Facebook ever decided not to operate in a country because the way in which the laws required handover of data or terms of use to be adopted was so fundamentally against the fundamental freedoms and rights of these people that it was just not squared?
I can't think of a situation where we've exited operating in a country. One of the things we are trying to do is we're trying to provide the most speech for the most people. Certainly, we have declined to do things that governments have asked us to do, and then we have ended up being blocked. And you can read about that on a regular basis, that we'll be blocked often for a short time, but there are some countries in which none of our products are available. There's one very large country in Asia where that's true. In many types of, I think if you do the analysis of why that is, it's because we are not willing to do the things that they want us to do.
So I wanted to pick up again on the notion of universal human rights and laws that you touched upon, because I think in an ideal world we would all like, all universal human rights to be respected all the time, and unfortunately that's not the world that we live in. And at the same time we are faced with technological development that often outpaces the pace of at least democratic lawmaking. So are we now at a moment where there's almost a role reverse between tech companies in, making decisions about how to deal with different jurisdictions, setting norms de facto? I mean, it's not only dependent on the law, but if Facebook decides that breastfeeding is inappropriate and doesn't show pictures of women breastfeeding, then that becomes a norm, et cetera, et cetera. So are tech companies, especially because they're so large oftentimes and because they operate globally, essentially taking over parts of the roles that governments traditionally used to have?
I hope not. That would be my short answer. There are days when we have to make decisions, and there are days when we do make decisions on an international or even global basis, and there are days when we can make decisions faster than governments can. and we're not typically in a position of waiting. So there are times when we, in effect, may be influencing where norms go, or we may, in effect, be making choices that will impact how people are able to use technology where they live. And I think these are heavy responsibilities, and they're decisions that we do make on a regular basis. I was in a meeting on Monday in Seattle where we said no to data centers in 2 countries because we were not comfortable that we could protect the human rights of the individuals who would have email stored in those data centers. We're having to make decisions in real time about certain AI scenarios and what it would mean to have those technologies deployed in countries that have more authoritarian regimes. I do think that it is helpful to consider to some degree the difference between different types of technologies. Facebook is a community. We have LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a community. And I think it's reasonable, in my view, for a community to decide that it wants to have certain community standards. And it therefore may not permit certain content to be viewed, even though that content is legal. Now, we then take a different view oftentimes when we think about a search engine. Because if you were to apply to a search engine the same community standards that you would apply to, say, a social media community, you could effectively foreclose the ability of people around the world to find information on the internet. And so, therefore, when it comes to most of the time, with just a couple of exceptions, the information that's available through a search engine, we're much more inclined to say that if it's legally permissible, it should be findable, it should be searchable, through, say, our search engine, Bing.
Switching back to Facebook for a moment, again, I think it's not a secret that the company is in a tight spot. If you read Wired, which is sort of like the Economist for techies, you see an illustration of Mark Zuckerberg bruised, and the article is also bruising. It's quite an investigative article about alleged lacks of checks and balances in the company. There have been questions about the sense of embedding people in political campaigns to help them be as successful as they could be. Could you speak to the lessons learned? Is it really a matter of reputation management, or are there also fundamental lessons learned where at Facebook there is now a realization this is what we should have handled differently when it comes to our role and the impact on democracy?
Yeah, I think absolutely there have been fundamental changes in how we approach protecting democracies and what we see as our responsibility. This has always been a balance, and especially in the context of political speech in free democracies. We have both a responsibility to protect those democracies from inappropriate influence, while also being very, very careful to not be the ones who decide what is legitimate political speech. And I think the difficulty of that balance hasn't sometimes paralyzed us in a way that was not helpful in the last couple of years. And I think our recognition of what happens when we don't take an active role is one of the biggest things that have changed. And so as a result, where we are now with elections, so there's something like 50 to 60 major elections per year. We have a task force that is comprised of people from across the company, our public policy team who works with governments, our cultural and language experts for every region, our threat intel team who tracks threat actors, a number of product engineers and product developers. In an elections task force, we look at these elections, we triage them as to what we think the level of risk is, and we try to come up with a plan for each of them that is appropriate for what we think the risk might be in that specific situation, what the government is like, and our history of what we have seen both on Facebook and elsewhere of what has happened in those democracies. And so we have definitely learned that we have to have an active role in looking around the corner and thinking about what is the way our products and technologies can be misused, especially in the use of in the context of elections, but not solely in the context of elections. When we look at the activity that we've uncovered around Russian information operations on Facebook, the majority of them predated even the primaries in the United States election, and a lot of that content actually came after the election. The people who are trying to influence political speech are doing so in a much longer term than just supporting one political party or supporting one candidate. They are trying to create nihilism in the West around our institutions, and the idea that democracy, while flawed, is the best way that we should govern ourselves. And so that is a long-term battle. So while we do focus on elections, and we have learned a lot about elections, we've also learned that we cannot take our eyes off the ball at any moment, because that battle is being fought every single day.
And how does that translate to better oversight of algorithms as well? Because I understand that you can invest human capital in this, but there's a lot of questions about algorithmic oversight, algorithmic accountability, you know, what code decides what filtering of information. Do we even know when there's biases or discrimination creeping in? And this is a question for both of you. How are we going to ensure that there is that kind of oversight and checks and balances, not only within companies, but also from a rule of law point of view?
I think what you're talking about is important not only for the technology today, but it's probably even more important for the future of artificial intelligence. And especially when one puts it in the context of AI, I think we need to start by having really a global conversation about the ethics of AI. What are the ethical principles that we want people to uphold? We last month published a book where we at least did our best effort to identify 6. You know, and the first one was fairness or avoidance of bias. It's also reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, and then there's transparency and accountability. I think that in some ways one of the richest conversations that will take place is around bias. Eric Schmidt was talking before, I think correctly, in saying that a big part of this goes to having a data set that is unbiased. If you have bias in the data set, you're likely to have bias in the algorithm. Of course, you could take it one step even further back. If you have bias in the people who create the data set, you're more likely to have bias in the data set. And I actually think it just makes it a fundamental imperative for the technology sector to focus with even greater urgency on the need for greater diversity in the technology sector if we're going to successfully avoid bias. Now, ultimately, I believe we're going to need AI law, because you just have to ask yourself, if we can develop a consensus on AI ethics, do we only want ethical people to behave ethically, or do we want everyone who creates this technology to behave ethically? Given the critical role the technology is going to play, I think we must have a future that ensures that people do behave ethically, and the only way to ensure that they do so will be, in effect, to have the kinds of laws that reflect the values we want to uphold. Now, having said that, I don't think one should try to write the laws until first one figures out what the ethical principles are that should go in them.
So is it a promise that is feasible to say we're going to make sure that there are algorithms without bias, data sets without bias, or is it much more about governance that works out these differences? For example, you know, when you talk about search or when you talk about filtering information, personally I believe that one of the risks is sort of dictatorship of the majority, right? As long as many people report something, want something, click something, it surfaces and the rest may not surface. I heard Eric Schmidt saying in the previous panel, people can decide how much hate they want themselves. Well, I'm maybe of the conservative belief that there are also laws to protect against hate speech. So to what extent is it even an attainable promise to say we will try to design without bias, or is it rather about navigating the various biases in a democratic way?
It's definitely an attainable promise to say we will try. The real
Oh, that's
question
always
is, will we succeed? And you know, I would say over the last 250 years, technology has fundamentally made our world better in so many respects, but it's not like we live in nirvana. You know, so you know, one needs to always keep that in mind. And at a certain level, I would say there's almost a fundamental set of cultural challenges that one needs to think about. I think there's 2. I think the biggest cultural challenge for governments is the challenge of sometimes making decisions slower than the pace of change. And I think the fundamental cultural challenge in the tech sector is sometimes making decisions faster than the speed of thought. And we each need to work on that. Governments are going to need to move faster. And I think that in the tech sector, we always have to be mindful that in some ways, overconfidence can be a huge problem. And that's why I think that we need to strive to just say remove bias from data sets that produce algorithms, but we also need to have the humility to recognize that if we can't remove bias from human beings, what really makes us think that we can remove bias from the technology that human beings create? Therefore, we must have governance. There must be a continuing opportunity to work through these challenges in a real-world way when they arise.
And that brings us back to the question of how do we provide for oversight? So if you could address that also, algorithms, the oversight, the accountability.
Yeah, I think it would be a mistake to think that we can build bias-free AI. That would be the easy techno-utopian idea that would be a really bad one, and it's the kind of mistake I think we're not going to make anymore. We understand pretty deeply that machine learning ends up reflecting the biases of the people that build it, but especially of the training data that is fed to it. I think of AI, my hotel down the street, it's got that mirror that hotels have that is curved and amplifies all of your features, right? So like if you have a pimple, it's the size of a golf ball, right? And you can see, all of the flaws. I feel like AI is like that. It is the funhouse mirror turned on our society that when we ask machine learning to take over human decision-making processes, what it uncovers is the bias that was already existent in that. In the United States, one of the big debates recently has been, there's been a number of journalists have done some great work discovering that the legal and law enforcement world has been using AI to substitute or to supplement human decisions around how much should people be punished for crimes, should this person be released from parole, and it is being trained based upon the data of crimes and criminals and convictions that have existed before, and is completely predictable, if you take the output of a biased, honestly racist system in the United States and you feed it into AI, it is going to grab onto those biases and amplify them. And so I think in this case, that's actually been a great opportunity for us to see that the base human decisions were never unbiased, and that we have to address those issues before we think that we can train a machine to do a better job than we can.
And who is we? You mean Facebook, or are we as collective of different stakeholders? Who has to address this?
So I think it is our responsibility I think it is unrealistic that stakeholders outside of the companies that are building these technologies are going to be able to control specifically how we root out these biases. I think what we need is norms of how do we test for the output of these systems to make sure that output is not biased, and that we have transparency and discussion around that.
The thing that I think is so important about your last question is that ultimately this is a question for everybody in the room and to a large degree everybody around the world, because AI systems are going to be built everywhere. Our whole strategy as a company when it comes to AI is to take the various building blocks of artificial intelligence, like computer vision, like speech recognition, like language translation, like aspects of machine learning, and then make them available as separate building blocks so that every business, every NGO, every government, every intergovernmental organization can then build its own AI solutions. And I think that's, on the one hand, of fundamental value to the future. It means that the benefits of AI will be disseminated widely, and it also means that these decisions about how AI emerges will not be concentrated in the hands of a few companies. But there's a huge but. It then means that you have to really instill this thinking about ethics much more broadly. And I also think it has very significant and generally positive ramifications for how technology is created. Because on the one hand, it means that digital coding, computer science, data science skills are going to be needed in more places. But when you think about what it means to create an AI system, you're fundamentally trying to create a computer that can think more like a human being, or how we want a human being to think. And so I think it means that we're going to find people educated in the humanities and the social sciences playing a role in the development of technology to a greater degree in the next 20 years than the last 20 years. And in fact, creating that combination, that multidisciplinary approach, is going to be essential.
If I may, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I almost have to bring it to a close. I'm sorry, because I was just flagged that we're already going over time. And so
We do have to follow the law. That is a
well,
requirement.
I want to be respectful for the organizers and everybody's time, but I wish we could talk longer, of course. And so in light of the comments that Brad made about the need for laws, versus companies that actually pretty much go fast forward until they hit a wall, disregarding the law, I would like to ask both of you if you could give a few laws on your wish list that you wish were there and are not there, and where they should be made on a national level, on an international level, in a multi-stakeholder manner. Also considering the notion that this is a panel about democracy and technology, and that for the moment China is investing heavily in AI and it's not a democracy.
Well, I'll just give you a couple examples, but these are sort of, off the top, random examples, but they are examples that relate to the topic of the day. Certainly when it comes to the protection of democracy, I think we need to look at the laws in place and ask where they need to be clarified or supplemented. To me, the most obvious one really is about how to think about paid advertising, paid political advertising on social media platforms. It doesn't make sense to me to think that we should have paid political rules for ads that appear in newspapers, radio, and television, but not on the internet, whether it's a search ad or a social media ad or a display ad. And I think there's a healthy conversation that will undoubtedly need to reflect the nuances of individual countries and their election laws. But that's one where I would hope that we could make some relatively rapid progress. The other area where we've been quite vocal is in saying there needs to be greater clarity around international law. Because the thing that is sometimes lost, in my view, when we're talking about nation-state attacks on democracy, is that as important as it is for the tech sector to be doing more and to be filling in gaps in domestic law, these are nation states that are doing this, and we know who they are. And we need to have clarity that they are acting in an unlawful way if we want them to stop. Because otherwise it's going to be a perpetual game of technological cat and mouse. And so that means two things. One is we need to identify where international law already applies and bars this kind of activity that we find objectionable to democracy. And then second, where there are gaps in the law, I believe we need to take steps to fill them. And I think that is one of the real causes of our time.
Yeah, so I agree with Brad. I think in the election protection, we are going to need new laws. We follow local election law when it comes to paid advertising. It is sometimes extremely difficult to apply laws that were written around radio and television to the internet. And so there does need to be some modernization of those laws, and then hopefully some normalization just here in the EU. Every single country is completely different in how they treat paid advertising. It would be a lot easier for us to address these issues if there was normalization. I know I'm asking for a lot there. I think in the US, one of the things that Brad has been a real leader on that we are supportive of is to make sure the law reflects the fact that we are in international platforms and that we need to have relationships with law enforcement around the world that is not only governed by US courts, but that we have the ability to interact with law enforcement around the world in a way that is respectful of human rights, but does not require the processes that are extremely onerous right now, that makes it hard for us and makes it hard for you folks here. Here in the EU, I think it's less about a new law and more about an ask, which is I think there seems to be, when you talk about regulation of the tech companies, there are the data protection people, there are the economic protection folks, and then the national security people are over here. And these two people are working together, these groups of people are working together. There's very little discussion about how data protection law interacts with safety and security. And the truth is that there are two trains on a train track running into each other, in that the things that are being asked of the major tech companies for us to do to keep individuals safe from terrorism, to enforce rules against extremists, especially around to detect advanced adversaries and to stop them from influencing elections. Those asks are incompatible with the direction of data protection law, where we will not have the data that we need to do those investigations or to turn over to governments, or that we will have rules that people are discussing around us turning over how algorithms work. If we are forced to tell the Internet Research Agency of St. Petersburg how our machine learning algorithm detected their fake accounts, then that is unilateral disarmament. And so in a future where we're going to be dealing with computational propaganda and all kinds of greater sophistication from our threat actors, we also need to make sure that the national security world reflected here is part of the conversation around privacy and data protection, because there is a conflict there that we don't see being worked out right now, and it'd be better to work it out now than when something bad happens and it gets fixed later.
Well, thank you both for laying out the agenda that we have to all come together on. It's no easy task, but I think this community with people who care about security, democracy, universal human rights, but also the economic and human potential of technology that we shouldn't forget are a good crowd for that. So please join me in thanking our two speakers for this session.